On the line with us is our old friend Victoria Jones, the chief Washington analyst for DC Radio Company, LLC. Her website, Victoria Jones, her Twitter handle, Victoria Jones DC. And Victoria, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Tom.
It's great having you with us. So I understand that in the UK, the Me Too movement is being stopped in its tracks by male judges. And I don't think there's any parallel to that here in the United States, although educate me if there is. What's going on over there?
Well, I'm not familiar with any parallel here in the U.S., and we're certainly in the U.S., they're hoping, some are anyway, that it's a temporary halt. What has happened is that the Telegraph, which is a broadsheet, one of the, as you know, leading newspapers, got a tip-off in February that a very senior, powerful businessman behaved appallingly towards women. So they started investigating, and they started talking to a lot of former staff and associates to see if the allegations were true. And the sources who had known him for between 10 and 20 years described how they'd been bullied, threatened, and intimidated. So once they'd spoken to more than 24 people, Telegraph said, yeah, apart from the alleged bullying, there were even more serious accusations of sexual harassment and racism against staff. And so they thought, yeah, we're really onto something here. The businessman became aware of this. And then in April, the PR people contacted them, and the Telegraph, just continued. Then they got legal letters arguing that the claims were defamatory and bullying and harassment, and warned that harassment is a criminal offense which can lead to your journalist being fined or imprisoned. So the reporters just continued. Businessman then contacted editors and executives, warning them to desist. Then the Telegraph found it had enough to publish. And that's when they, contacted him again, and that's when it ended up in court, at which point a judge ruled, a very senior judge ruled, that, in fact, they should be able to go ahead. Justice Haddon Cave said the story was in the public interest, even though there were non-disclosure agreements, and some staff had been paid off. And that the stories were reasonably credible, but there was little or no reasonable expectation of confidentiality, and nor was the information obtained in breach of the NDA's confidentiality set. And it was in the public interest and in the interest of public discourse in a democracy. And so the businessman appealed. Now, by this time, by the way, this justice had been promoted to the appeals court, the second highest court in the land. And this appeals court just decided, with the exception of this justice, that no, in fact, non-disclosure agreement, confidentiality agreements for businesses, despite all these other things which they said were wonderful, press freedom, blah, 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 public interest, non-disclosure agreements were probably more important. And despite the fact that the Telegraph pointed out in its arguments, its lawyers did, that the victims' names would not be published in the story, there would be no breach of confidentiality.
Here's what baffles me about this. I mean, setting aside the libel laws in the UK are strong enough that you can still sue a newspaper. You can not still. I mean, you can sue a newspaper if you don't like what they say, even if you're a public figure. But at least here in the United States, and I thought this was a principle of international law, although I'm not an attorney, I just write books about the law, but I thought that it was not possible, literally not possible, to execute a binding contract that involves a violation of the law. So if this man is having these women that he has harassed sign non-disclosure agreements in exchange for money, that's not against the law. But his initial harassment of them is against the law. So you can't use a contract to get around law breaking, at least in this country. Is that what's going on in the UK? Is that what you're telling me?
That is basically what's going on in the UK. And this is causing some scratching of heads even of lawyers. And there's some very interesting op-eds being written, one by one senior lawyer saying that it's going to raise concerns about how NDAs are used to cover up potential wrongdoing. And also, there was a hearing before a parliamentary committee, and there were questions in Parliament, and there were lawyers asked about, and they answered, yes, no, we do everything in the client's interest. In fact, it says, the obligation is to behave with integrity in the client's interest.
Okay, could it be, Victoria, that, I mean, you know, when Donald Trump tried to enforce his non-disclosure agreement against Stormy Daniels, and then her lawyer made the argument that, you know, this should be all public because, you know, technically what he did was adultery, which is against the law, and basically, I'm not even sure that this got to the judge ruling, but I remember the debate about it, that in California, I guess, is where it took place, that adultery is actually not against the law there anymore. So therefore, he could have an NDA with Stormy Daniels because it wasn't against the law. Could it be that the types of harassment that are on the verge of being exposed by the Telegraph are not specifically prohibited by British law? That it's just, you know, immoral and embarrassing, legally speaking?
Some of these are against the law. Some of this racist behavior, the bullying behavior, the sexual harassment, this is criminal behavior.
Then how can they hide it with a contract?
That's the point. And Theresa May was asked about that today in Prime Minister's Question Time, and she indeed said that this was appalling and that it needs to be looked into and that things need to be done.
Do you think you've got a couple of judges here on the appeals court who are you know, just as guilty of sexual harassment as the guy who's trying to shut this down, and they're just covering their own butts? No pun intended.
Well, what you do have is judges with a background in contract and employment law. That's what you do have. I can't speak to the other things. And I think, you know, when you have that, you have judges who look at things a certain way. You know, with the first judge, you had a judge with a very strong background in terrorism law, anti-terrorism law, and some very strong rulings on freedom of the press. These other judges have a strong background in contract and employment law. Now, they did say there needs to be a speedy trial, but one lawyer who was quoted in the Telegraph article raised the point that isn't it odd that you can have non-disclosures and so you can have confidentiality if you're rich, but you can't have confidentiality if you're poor.
Yeah, if you're rich or if you're in a position of power over somebody else,
yes,
like as an employer,
yes,
for example. Remarkable stuff. Victoria Jones, she is the chief Washington analyst with the DC Radio Company. You can tweet her at Victoria Jones DC. Victoria, keep us up to date on how this story evolves, will you?
Oh, I will.
Thank you very much. It's great having you with us. It's great to hear your voice on our air again. Victoria Jones with the DC Radio Company. Thank you, Victoria.